Today we have two of our counselors from Summit Counseling Ministry, Don Waller and Shannon Collins, and we're going to have a discussion today about anxiety. Now, we have talked about anxiety when we were doing Navigating the New Normal, and we were talking specifically about COVID-19. And of course, little did we know that COVID-19 was going to be a bigger issue today even than it was back then. But we also want to talk about anxiety in other forms besides the pandemic. Seems to be something that all of us struggle with from time to time. And so we're so grateful to have these two who are here with us today to kind of talk us through what anxiety is and kind of give us some tips on how to handle it when it comes up. And so, again, thank you all for being here this evening.
Thank you.
I just want to kind of begin with giving us a handle of anxiety because, you know, I think all of us experience some type of anxiety from time to time. But at what point would you say anxiety becomes a problem? Specifically, what signs should we look for in that regard?
I think you're right. We all have differing levels of it at different times in our lives, depending on the stressors around us. But I would say that it becomes a problem when you're not able to normally function in your daily life, and that I would say maybe the word is when you're consumed with the anxious thoughts, consumed with the feeling of those thoughts just keeping on bombarding you so much that you kind of feel like you can't get through it. That's when I would say it's more of an anxiety really that you're concerned about than just everybody has anxiety each day about this and that.
Right.
I think anytime it affects how you function and how you do life in general, when you feel less than. And I think, you know, people can feel overwhelmed, and anxiety that really manifests or morphs into a panic attack. I've had people go to the hospital thinking they were having a heart attack. So it can definitely get out of hand if not treated.
So let's look at it from this angle. Everybody feels stress.
Yes.
At what point does stress become an anxiety for us, where stress begins to be too hard? Is it things like irritability, or when you begin to see relationship problems? What would you say about that?
I think that when if someone comes to me and they a lot of times will say I have anxiety, they will just come out and and say that because they are feeling and experiencing it. And then other times I think people are not certain. Am I depressed? Am I anxious? Is this normal stress? And for some people, if you have 4 or 5 big stressors going on in your life at one time, maybe problems in your marriage, problems in your job, problems with your children, problems with finances, and then you talk to them and you say, you hear what they have to say and they list all of their issues and you go, it's okay. You're overwhelmed, and anyone would be.
Right.
And sometimes when you normalize that for them and say, I would be too. If I had that many stressors going on in my life, I think sometimes that helps them to just automatically go, I'm okay. I'm okay. Just to kind of normalize it for them. If anyone in that situation would be overwhelmed as well. I think what your question though is when things seem like maybe I should be able to handle this and I can't, or it's a little thing and I've made the molehill mountain thing. I've made this little small thing into something that's consuming me every day. That's when I would say there's the difference that
and I agree. I think when it affects your relationships, when it affects your job, your performance, when you're starting to feel overwhelmed and you're not able to engage in normal behavior, that's when it's a problem.
Well, and sometimes I think probably all of us have a tendency of just in our minds we say, I've got to snap out of this.
Yes.
But sometimes it's just not that easy.
That's right.
That's right.
And so that's kind of where we need to begin to talk to somebody and try to find some help. Let's talk for a second. I heard you say a little bit earlier that anxiety and fear are oftentimes seen as cousins. Explain that.
Yeah. Well, I think with fear, with anxiety and fear, the way they kind of connect is that a lot of times we're fearful of what might happen. we're afraid of, something that's going to happen next week. We're afraid, maybe with this illness, are we going to get, we're afraid that we might get sick. We're afraid we're going to fail. And it's not necessarily even something that is likely to happen, but we're so consumed with it that we cannot function because we keep thinking about it over and over and over again. It's that obsessiveness of thinking of it over and over again that I think really is where the problem is keen.
Yeah. And I've had clients tell me that racing thoughts, and they get fixated, and it's like I can't quit thinking about it, or I can't get past it, and sometimes they have tightness of chest, sometimes their breathing is shallow, and we just go through a lot of exercises on how to, whether it's breathing exercises, what is your routine, are you drinking coffee, just things like that, and just try to find out what is their daily routine and how is that affecting the anxiety, their thoughts.
Yeah. Great. And I do want to get to some solutions here in a little bit, but let's talk about, as I talked at the very beginning, the COVID-19 pandemic. And certainly there is a lot of anxiety related to that. And of course now some of that's well-founded. I mean, we're seeing cases go up, and so it needs to be taken very seriously. And we need to be taking the precautions that are being suggested for us. But sometimes we can go too far. Sometimes we can, as you said, fear can kind of begin to creep in. What advice would you give to somebody who's feeling some anxiety over the COVID-19 pandemic and it's really keeping them from living life?
I think, fear versus facts. Okay, the cases are increasing. I think there were 50,000 yesterday.
Sure.
But I think the severity of the cases are not as severe as far as people going to hospitals. Not that the hospitals aren't coming up, but in my case, I've talked to a lot of clients who have family members that have had it, and it's not that serious as far as affecting them physically. They might run fever and they may lose the smell and they may lose their taste, but they're not in bed with chills, or they're not going to the doctor. I mean, they're basically just kind of riding it out. And so not knowing the effects of how it could affect you. I've heard that taking vitamin D, taking your vitamins and making sure that your immune system is up seems to be a good indicator on how it's going to affect you if you catch it. So much of fear comes from the unknown, and just having a little more of a realistic, okay, what could happen if I catch it, versus just the severe what the press reports. And sometimes that's kind of puts in our mind that, hey, if I get this, I'm going to be on a ventilator. Or it could be fatal.
And
Watch too much news.
I think sometimes too, it's that negative loop we get in. And it's a negative thought, and then that cycles into your negative self-talk. And so you might hear somebody say something like this, like, "Oh my gosh, I'm going to get it. I know I am. I know I'm going to get it. I'm going to get it." And them saying that to themselves over and over again just increases the anxiety. And so if they change that loop somehow by trying to stop the thought, or trying to stop what they're saying to themselves by saying, if I get it, the statistics show I'm probably going to be all right. Or saying something like, I'm a healthy person. Over and over to themselves, and trying to, like he said, focus on the fact, but also not let yourself get in that negative loop and keep it on. And so it's a discipline. I mean, it's a no one else can get in your head and tell you to stop. So it's a discipline of saying, I'm not going to allow myself to do that. As much as you can possibly control it. Because we can't help what thought comes into the brain. I mean, it's just there. But we can help that over and over loop. We can say stop and try to distract ourselves.
It's a good point. I like the word stop there, and discipline. When you say that in some cases, we just consume too much media. And when I think particularly of the COVID-19, I mean, there's no question that it's bad, and there's no question that for some people, for sure, the consequences are incredibly dire. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be what you suffer through. But when you watch TV, you watch the news, what you see is the number of hospitalizations, you see the number of deaths.
Yes.
They don't give you all of the people who have had it and have gotten
Done okay.
better.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that as a negative towards the news stations. I'm just
Right.
saying news is kind of more about big information,
Yes.
not all of the things that are happening in
That's
regular
right.
day-to-day life. And so sometimes we just need to take a step back away from news or
yes.
away from social media.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because don't you think sometimes
Oh,
that
absolutely.
just sensationalizes
Yes.
things for us? Yeah.
Yeah, it feeds it.
Yeah, it
You know,
feeds it,
and
yeah.
and especially if you're a person who struggles with anxiety over a lot of things, then
Yeah.
you know that about yourself maybe, and so you know to feed it is just going to make it worse.
Right.
So you have to set limits yourself and boundaries on. I just can't look at that today. I know it's real and I know it's out there, but I can't look at it, and I have to minimize. You know, for the people who have anxiety and then they're spending 6 hours a day watching it, it's
Yeah.
just amping that up even more.
Right.
You're just feeding it, right?
Yeah, it's feeding it.
Yeah. Pandemics, I mean, those are big things.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that probably hits families maybe even harder or maybe brings a little bit more anxiety has to do with finances.
Yeah.
And of course, pandemics don't help finances.
That's right.
Right.
And so we see about how the economy's struggling, we hear about layoffs.
Right.
People probably going to work every day wondering if they're the one who's next, who's going to be lose their jobs. So what do you say to a person who is just kind of looking, you know, at their checkbook and they're looking at the bills that are coming in and they're saying this is what's expected every month, but I could lose my job? I mean, you know, the anxiety over money. What do you say to that person?
I like to ask them, give me your big picture. Tell me what your obligations are. Tell me, what, you know, not necessarily your income, but I'd like to know where they're coming from to make sure that they're not fixated on just the negative.
Yeah.
I try to expand their, you know, so their negative thinking, we call it NATs, negative automatic thoughts. Are you going right toward, what if I lose my job? What if I lose my job?
Right.
And you get fixated
Yeah.
and you're ruminating that can cause anxiety. And I think I just try to redirect them. And of course, if they're believers, I ask them, are you going to Scripture daily? Are you doing your daily disciplines? Are you doing your unhurried time with God? Are you talking about it through your spouse? You know, coming and doing talk therapy can be so helpful because it's in your head, and sometimes in your head can just get blown out of proportion.
Gnats is such a good word because
Yeah.
the small things are
gnats
just
are
around
annoying.
you all the time. You can't get rid of and so those
Right.
negative thoughts. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I think if you're like Don was talking about and me talking about the negative loop, you know, discipline is definitely an element in that, and distraction too, you know,
Yeah.
at times,
Yeah.
because sometimes, you know, if you're sitting there thinking about your finances, you know, again, you know, 4 or 5 hours a day, you're just thinking on that. You have to discipline yourself to do a different thing, and part of that, I think, like Don said, are you worshiping? Are you praying? Part of our Christian walk and our discipline in that is surrender. You know, and a lot of times I think that what we're doing with our anxiety is we are trying to be self-reliant and thinking that we can take care of it, when in certain ways there is that element of surrender that the Lord wants us to walk in with Him, that says, you know, I'm going to be prepared about my job. I'm going to, if I think I'm fixing to lose this one, maybe I need to be looking, you know, for another job. I need to be prepared, but I can't control anything.
Yeah.
And part of that is just the surrender of, I know I have to lay this down in certain ways. Once I'm prepared and, you know, have all my information, like Don said, you know, bringing it all out and looking, is it really as bad as I think? You know, listing it out, your financial stuff.
Yeah.
You know, and then when you look at it, you know, maybe it's not as bad as you think, and you think, you know, if I just tweak this and that, I could really help myself. But the surrender of, once I've done all I can do and I'm as prepared as I can be, then I just have to leave it to the Lord and lay it down.
Exactly.
So anxiety, what I'm hearing you say, is a little bit actually of our struggle with control,
I think
Yes.
so.
because we want to know what tomorrow holds.
That's right.
Yes.
We want to know that everything is just the way we planned it, and life just is not always that way.
That's right. And it's the fear of what will happen. And some of that, again, is really a faith issue and
Yeah.
a test.
Yeah.
Because what will happen? Well, the Lord's going to walk with us. And if I get COVID, I just have to walk through that, try to do everything I can the doctors tell me to do, and trust the Lord to heal me. That's all we can do in certain things if you're doing everything you can to keep yourself from getting it.
Yeah, yeah, wow. Another place I think we feel anxiety sometimes, particularly as parents, is with our kids.
Yes.
Definitely.
You know, just I think about, you know, when my kids turned 16, they got their driver's license. You know, those are anxious moments when
Yes.
you're sitting at home waiting for that car to pull back in the driveway.
Yes.
Or my older two are in college, and you know, they drive off to school, and there's that anxiety of, did we do enough?
Yes.
Did we
Yeah.
spend enough time? Did we invest enough? Did we, you know, so just as parents, you feel anxiety. And then, of course, even when children are younger, you know, there's a real temptation for us to look at what every other parent's doing.
Right.
And then
Compare.
begin to feel some anxiety because we're not doing exactly what they're doing. We don't have
Right.
those tutors, we don't have those coaches, we don't
right.
have. What do you say to parents who struggle with that?
You know, first I think you got to go to the Lord and you got to say, these are yours that you gave me to raise.
Yeah,
And maybe I didn't raise them perfectly, but they're yours.
Yeah.
And Yanni and I, my wife and I, tend to reassure ourselves where God has been faithful through their lives coming up the first 18 years. And I'm sending my baby off here
Yeah.
in about 6 weeks. And so learning to trust God and remember that He's been faithful. Remember that He's going to see them through, because we can't be there with them in college. We can't, you know, you can't lay awake at night wondering what's going on. You've got to give them to the Lord. And I think that's just a daily practice. As you, if you're surrendering, you got to surrender your kids to the Lord and just ask God for wisdom. Is there anything I could say? Is there anything I need to do? And trust God to help you with that.
what a great statement. I think about, it makes me think of the Old Testament, and particularly Joshua. Joshua's my favorite character in the Old Testament. And Joshua, as a leader of Israel, was really good when he publicly spoke to the people of reminding them of what God had done for them up to this point.
Yeah.
And so you kind of see the point there as you see God at work in your life yesterday, that will affect the way you see Him today and tomorrow.
Yes.
And so that's a great point. Yeah,
Yes.
great point.
Yes, God's faithfulness, you know,
Yeah.
remembering. But I really think that probably this element of anxiety is probably the hardest with your children, because you value and treasure them so much
Right.
that you're scared. That's
Yeah.
where the fear comes in. You know, I'm scared this will happen and that will happen, and you know, I think that's one of the hardest ones to release. You know, even though we know we don't have the power to go with them where they're going, or you know, protect them from every little thing. It's one of the hardest ones, I think, for parents, is with your children. But I think that it's still the same protocol. It's still, you know, what else can we do besides the surrender? I mean, we can't. Some people try to over control with that. You know, I'm going to control every single aspect, and then that doesn't work.
All right.
Yeah.
So it just causes more problems.
Yeah, right. So let's talk about some of the solutions you talked about earlier, about breathing and those kind of things. So for a person who's struggling with anxiety, what are just some simple, spur of the moment, first aid kit kind of things that they can do to help themselves?
First of all, I ask them, I say, do you know breathing exercise? Focus on your breathing. On a count of 3, inhale through your mouth. Inhale through your nose, exhale through your mouth on a count of 6. Focus on your breathing. Now watch your chest come up, let that air come in, and exhale it. And what you're doing is you're lowering your pulse by breathing exercises.
Yeah.
You're putting oxygen in the blood, you're getting into your brain, and it's actually helping you relax. And those relaxation techniques, especially breathing, can be extremely helpful. But I usually ask the client, I said, okay, are you drinking coffee late in the afternoon? Are you drinking too much coffee? Do we need to eliminate that? Are you eating 3 meals a day? Are you going to bed at the same time? Are you eliminating screen time an hour or so before you go to bed? There's just certain, routines that we do daily that help us from, staying in a zone where you're going to be less likely to be anxious. And of course, I've also got some 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, where if you're having an anxiety attack, I get people to look, stop, look at 5 things and notice 5 things, see those. 4th, look at 4 things that you can touch. Look around and touch 4 things. 3, look at 4 things that you can smell. And then 2 things that you can taste. And then 1 thing that you can, I've done seeing, touching, hearing. I left out hearing. So you hear things, okay? Maybe I'm hearing somebody talk outside, or maybe I'm hearing the air condition run. What you're doing is redirecting your thoughts. Yeah. And some of these little small exercises that you can remember in your head to do will take those, those, what do you call it, overwhelming thoughts out of your head. You're just redirecting your thoughts.
Yeah.
I think it's so helpful.
I think those are excellent things to do in the moment, like you said, for the first aid. Like right now, I am overwhelmed and I don't know what to do. Mm-hmm. I think that the breathing and those techniques, the sensory things, are great to do in the moment. I think to try to keep yourself from getting to that, red alert moment. Mm-hmm. There are other things too to kind of get you, to help you not get there maybe. Yeah. And part of it is talking and in counseling, but also talking to, some people hold things in and hide it. Yes. And they're thinking these things and it has gotten to be so heavy for them, but they're not telling anybody. Mm. And they're overwhelmed in their mind, but they're not saying it. So there is no release whatsoever. So it just gets heavier and heavier and bombarding them more and more. So part of it is share, and say to your best friend or your parents or, your spouse, hey, I am struggling lately with all these thoughts and I am just tired of this. And part of, kind of putting that to death is letting it out. Yeah. And then I think also some people journal and write because, again, it's gotten so heavy. These thoughts are on their mind over and over and over again. They need a release. So if they can write, it's almost like you're like throwing that stuff up in essence and laying it out there, and maybe it's going to kind of give you some relief, and write. If you're worried about COVID, write it all out. I feel this. I'm worried about that. I wish this was happening. I'm tired of this. Just write it. And then some people do a physical thing to daily, like running or jogging or biking or something that helps them. Some people, if they're really stressed, they need to go on a walk. And then they'll say, when I got back from my walk, I felt better. And it's like you said, it's part of the distraction, changing your thought pattern. And then the spiritual aspect is prayer, taking time and stopping to pray, because that's kind of the spiritual release. You got the physical release and the exercise, you got the kind of the mental and emotional release with the writing. And so trying to kind of, I've noticed that different people get a different result. Like some people, if I said, you try to write, they'll be like, I don't like writing. But other people, that person might be, they need the physical thing. Everybody's different. But I think it's smart and wise to try all of those things and do a combination of releasing those thoughts, talking to someone, sharing it, all of those things. And then that way, maybe after you kind of practice that for a while, you go, it really works for me to blank, whichever one works best for you. Right. And that's to help you to not get to that moment where you're actually having to go, I gotta breathe, to helping with the release before you get there.
I want to ask you a question that's kind of an off-the-wall question.
Okay.
Anxiety is something that I've struggled with. Particularly obsessive compulsive disorder, and we've talked about that, and so it's something that's kind of, for me, and it has been an issue for me over really a lot of my adult life, and probably even younger. I just didn't realize it.
Right.
But when I was in Starkville, sometimes when I would be feeling anxious, my assistant could tell. And there would be times when, she would just say, you need to go up the street. And what she meant was up the street from the office was a place that sold great hamburgers and onion rings.
Yeah.
And it was funny
Good
because
comfort food,
the staff sometimes they could sense that I was a little anxious and having a difficult time, and it kind of began to be the joke, where they would come by her office and say, "Don't you think you need to send him up the street?" So my question there is there really a relation between food and anxiety? Because at least in my mind, sometimes I would be convinced that I felt a lot better,
Yeah.
even though I was not eating baked chicken.
Right.
I was eating a hamburger.
Yeah, but it's funny that you said that, because when you were talking about it, I was thinking about a member of my family who had called me one day and said, "Shannon, I feel like I'm about to just burst, and I'm so overwhelmed and that I can't think," and it kind of scared him.
Right.
And I told him, walk out of your office, go get in your truck, and drive down the road and go to Sonic and get you a drink.
Yeah.
And he was like, okay. I mean, he was like, is this really going to help me? But all I was trying to get him to do is to get out of that moment, and it's part of the distraction. So, maybe some of it was the food, some of it was the company for
Just
you,
getting outside,
some of it was just the change of scenery, because you didn't feel all of it coming on top of you and all the thoughts right there in the front of your mind. You're distracted.
That makes
doubt.
sense.
Yeah, no doubt. I think the distraction piece of going to a place, looking at the menu and ordering and not thinking about what was overwhelming you or what was on your mind that you needed to get done.
Yeah, yeah. I found comfort in seeing that a lot of pastors that you look at as heroes, Spurgeon and some of those greats, all struggled with anxiety. And, I think some of that has to do with, from a pastor's perspective, you have so much that you hear and so much that you deal with, and you do kind of internalize it, no question.
Oh, yeah.
Not long ago, I was during COVID when we were home on Sundays, and I would watch, of course, services here, but watch services at other places, and I saw a pastor was talking about prayer, and he was encouraging people to journal, which I've done for years on a laptop, but he was encouraging people to do it with pen and paper. And he was saying there's something in the brain about writing it actually with pen and paper that makes it even different than typing it on a computer.
Absolutely.
And so that's kind of what you're talking about as far as just getting some stuff. And I think the point he was making is you think more. You think about what you're going to write.
That's
and it's taking a little longer.
You access it.
Yeah.
When I'd get fixated on things, I would sit down and say, okay, to get them out of my head, I'd write them down on the journal. And I said, okay, God, I've put them down. I don't have to think about them anymore.
Yeah.
And so I've got stacks of journals over the years that I've just kind of put on thoughts and prayers, and that's been extremely helpful for me.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think, that some people are list makers. Like, for instance, if you're in your office and you had 7 people coming at you with a different thing, and you're thinking, I'm feeling overwhelmed. And when they walk out, I encourage my husband to do this, because he works in a setting where he is the boss, and he has a lot of people bringing him things.
Yeah.
And they don't know that, 7 people just brought him something else.
Right,
And so
exactly.
I used to tell him, you got to shut the door. And not all the time and not every day, but for maybe an hour, to give yourself a break because you can't take in anymore. You shut the door, and you tell the secretary, for the next hour, I've got to just process what I've got. And so that's a boundary thing, but it's also helpful because you're already overwhelmed and you can't take in anymore.
Right. Got to know your limit sometimes.
Yeah, you're
That's
at your
right.
limit.
Well, listen, our time unbelievably has gone by. So thank you so much for being our guests today. It's always great to visit with y'all, and you've given us some great biblical wisdom and great help. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us again tonight. And again, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of reaching out and asking for help. Now remember, here at First Baptist Jackson, Summit Counseling Ministry is such an incredible ministry here. What an incredible resource for you. If you would like to talk to someone, you can do it by telehealth right now. You can do it by Zoom. You can do it by call. I mean, they will be glad to work with you. However, if you'll contact the church office, we will be glad to help get you connected to some great counselors just like these who are here. And I want to remind you, as we've talked about today, the importance of remembering Christ and remembering the faithfulness of the Lord. Psalm 9:10 says, "Those who know your name will put their trust in you." We need to continually be reminded of the name of God because He is faithful. He is a strong tower. He is our refuge. Thank you again for joining us for Navigating Life. We hope to see you next month.